Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my basement, affectionately known as my wormery. And my wormery is really nothing more than these bins that you see behind me. A whole bunch of systems in which I'm composting with worms. And I've got a variety of different types of worms. The worms that I'm going to be checking in on today are called African night crawlers. And they're kind of a temperamental type of a worm that doesn't really work well in cool temperatures. And as the season that I'm in now, approaching winter, we're just about halfway through autumn now. As the temperatures down here in my wormery start to drop, I believe that we're going to see a slowing of the productivity of these systems. And the systems that I'm talking about kind of got nudged off the storage shelf over there. Wasn't quite enough room for them. Eventually there will be as the older systems get harvested and they move to the back of the line. The worms will get moved to the back of the line, the castings will get harvested. But the systems I'm checking in on today reside in these two bins down here, these two bus boxes. You can see I'm covering with paper only, and over a couple occasions now I felt like I've had to come in here with water to compensate for the loss of moisture due to evaporation. And I think today we're going to probably upgrade them to plastic coverings just to protect the existing moisture that's in there, not let it get lost to evaporation. And I think that'll also help with the composting of the material right down on the surface, because what's on the surface being a little bit dry generally doesn't see a whole lot of activity. So the food that I bought down is already up on the bench, set to go. The plastic coverings I'm going to be including today, in addition to the paper coverings, are already over there, all set to go. So let's get these bins up on the bench and get to work feeding them. The age of these systems is now a little bit over 2 months old, 67 days of age. It's been 12 days now since we last checked in on these bins and fed them. And this is going to be feeding number 7. So up until now, they were fed 6 times. And, you know, with a population close to 1,800 at the time of launch, could have grown by now, I would think that these are probably fairly capable systems. I'll be curious to see how the feeding they got last time is holding up. So yeah, like I said, once we get back to covering up over here, we're also going to put plastic over this. So hopefully in future check-ins, all this top surface will be a little bit more damp and a little bit less barren of activity. But I guess the absence of worm traffic out here on the surface is to be expected to a certain point. And I was even wondering if it would be necessary to add moisture to the system. And with all this dry stuff out here on the surface, I'm starting to get the sense that it might not hurt. There is a lot of leafy material out here, as you can see. I was pretty generous on giving them a nice thick top covering of stuff, and even though it's dry, I think it might also be kind of contributing to preventing some of the more damp material below it from drying too quickly. Because once we're down here already, things start to feel pretty good. Down the middle, where that coffee filter was resting in the middle, marking where we last fed, down the middle is where we would probably expect to see the greatest amount of moisture, where the last feeding was applied. As those materials thaw out, because they were probably added in here frozen, as they break down, they probably kick off a little bit of moisture. It's usually out here on the outer edges that I'm also a little bit concerned to see if things are holding up okay as far as moisture goes. Luckily, things seem pretty nice over here. Even on the farthest outer edge, I could see worms in the material. So that's a pretty good sign. I'm just wondering what to do with all this stuff. I'm just going to kind of keep nudging it out of my way, I suppose. And I am starting to think that maybe getting my squirt bottle out here, and after we apply the feeding and restore this top covering of material, maybe we'll apply a little bit of moisture. I'm even wondering if maybe rather than just keeping it around and applying it to the top surface, maybe we should drop it right down into the spot where the foods are going to be placed, and then give it some nice moisture before we cover it up. That would give it a far greater chance of seeing a whole bunch of worm activity if it's down low, if it's surrounded by the foods that we're giving them today. The only trick is going to be to make a adequate, opening a nice big enough space to fit it all. So we'll see if we can pull that off. A few feedings ago I fed pumpkin, and this was really part of a larger pumpkin stem. So I snapped it in half and I threw the other half into the other bin. And I'm sure that those chunks of pumpkin stem are going to outlast this system. These worms will probably be relocated, their castings will probably be harvested, and those stems will probably still be in progress and have to get moved over to continue. But it's sometimes fun to watch how a slow composting object like a stem of a pumpkin breaks down over time in a worm bin. Alright, we're only a couple weeks away from Halloween, so I'm probably going to have other pumpkin stems coming into my inventory of worm foods pretty soon. Not that I try to go out of my way to collect pumpkin stems to feed my worms, but in addition to all the yummy pumpkin that I'm probably going to be obtaining from people who have pumpkins out in front of their homes as jack-o'-lanterns or just as seasonal decorations, we'll eventually, you know, once the Halloween season comes and goes, we'll be looking to get rid of them, and that's usually my chance to scarf up those nice morsels, because the worms love that stuff, and as long as I've got a place to store it, I'm always happy to take it so that I can feed it to my worms. So why don't we just go ahead and actually follow through on that idea that we had earlier, is to just kind of build up the feeding area significantly, I guess, by using a lot of this stuff that was just sitting out on the surface, somewhat neglected, but still probably getting pretty thoroughly concentrated with all kinds of microbes and fungi and different things that are probably already present on those materials, although there's an absence of moisture and those things are probably not really too active right now. I bet once we moisten the stuff up, the breakdown process will kick right into high gear 1, 2, 3. You know, after almost 2 weeks of this stuff sitting in here, chances are that it's well staged to turn into like an almost ideal bedding for the worms. Almost going, you know, from being bedding to almost being food immediately. Sometimes I take, you know, almost completely sterile stuff and use it as the bedding in my feedings. And I usually expect that it's going to take some time before the worms can really use it as food. So in the beginning it's really just sort of bedding. But this stuff I think is almost at the point where you can almost treat it as food. But still, in my mind it is bedding, at least until I see signs of the worms eating it. I'm thinking before we drop in the leftovers and the fresh application of food today, I'm going to get my squirt bottle. Luckily it's right nearby, right beneath where I feed for easy access. And I don't remember if I had put this thing away with pressure in it already. I did. Kind of nice to be able to just grab that thing and go. It's almost like having a garden hose or a faucet right nearby, just in case moisture is needed. Once upon a time, I always used to use a squirt bottle to apply moisture into my systems, and the amount of moisture that you just observed me apply here over the past 10 seconds or so probably would have taken me about 5 minutes to pump out of my little squirt bottle into the feeding area. So I am being pretty generous. I got no problem with that. The stuff is quite dry and there is a good bit of it. So I think this is going to be a beneficial thing. I mean, the foods that we're applying today, stuff like, I don't even know, there's some potato peels, there's some banana peels, a variety of different things that are frozen. I assume that those things are also going to add to the moisture content of the bin as they thaw and get broken down. So a combination of the fresh foods going in with their moisture content plus the moisture that we just applied with the squirt bottle will probably result in pretty good moisture level in here. At least that's what I'm hoping for. Alright, so now this stuff was already starting to, I think when my mom gave it to me, she had already stored it in her freezer for a while. And then during that time period of me getting it home and getting it into my freezer, I think the stuff thawed a little bit, kind of making it mushy, kind of making it damp, and then when it refroze in my freezer, a lot of it sort of stuck together, making it a little bit more difficult to dislodge from each other and apply to the system. These are carrots. I think here we saw some peels of apple maybe. These things are obviously banana peels. We'll give each system a nice big banana peel. Yeah, I think if we leave what's in here now, that'll account for a pretty good fair split of the foods that they're getting here today. I sometimes, not always, but sometimes I'll include a little bit of this crushed eggshell with my feedings to serve as grit. And, oh yeah, I almost forgot. I've also got a little bit of coffee here that we can include with today's feeding. I don't remember, something about when I was reviewing the video from the last feeding seemed to me like we might have been a little bit skimpy on the feeding, but this feeding is the complete opposite. Tons and tons of bedding underneath the food, a pretty good amount of food as far as I'm concerned. What I just sprinkled in here on top of the coffee was my worm chow. So this is starting to come together quite nicely, but we're not quite done yet. I want to also turn to my remaining stash of prepared bedding here, which is shredded cardboard and paper and things like that. I just figured we would cap off this feeding with a little bit of this sort of stuff. That looks pretty nice. Perhaps one more handful, and then I'll have enough to finish off with. I just spent some time down here last night with my shredder, preparing a whole bunch of shredded paper and cardboard. So I'll be able to replenish my stock if we tap out what's here. And let's see. Oh yeah, there's one last thing. Although I don't see any signs of trouble right now, the water that I have in my little squirt bottle, this is the one that I made reference to earlier. This used to just simply be a way of applying moisture, but since I got the big squirt bottle, this has been changed over to using the mosquito dunks solution. And I think I'm really just kind of using it at this point as a preventative measure. I'm not seeing any flying insects, thank goodness, in my systems now, but maybe a month and a half ago I was starting to see the emergence of them. And that was following a period of time after I had run out of my supply of the BTI solution, the mosquito dunks solution. And pretty soon after running out and not using it in my systems regularly, I started seeing the return of flying insects. So I'm starting to wonder if it's a good thing to kind of keep adding, even in small amounts, to the systems, just as a preventative measure, just in case any flying insects do try to move in. It'll just keep them from getting a foothold. Although, you know, if I do start to see a little bit of an outbreak, there's always that opportunity to just push them back down and take care of them that way. But I don't know, it's kind of nicer just never having them around in the first place. All right, it does feel to me like we might have brought the whole level of the system up a little bit, which is kind of cool. And I think we've added enough moisture that we're not going to bother dousing the top surface. I think what we've done here is going to be quite fine. And once the plastic we're going to include, in addition to these paper top coverings, I think we're going to see that the moisture in here is going to be pretty good. It's going to even out. Even the stuff on the top surface will now start to get damp and start to see some worm traffic. So that's kind of nice too, because the worms will just see that as extra space, and it might even trigger a little bit of mating, a little bit of expansion of the population. So let's go get the second bin and get them fed too. All right, here we go. Now, I don't know, when I'm feeding bins in pairs this way, I always feel like I'm using the first bin as a little bit of a trial, and then the second one just feels like it goes a little bit quicker. Not sure if you saw it, but there was a little insect, fruit fly or gnat or whatever that is, which makes me suspect that we might see a couple more under the covers. Well, luckily, maybe he was just a rogue. There's a spider. Try not to harm him. So I'm going to deviate a little bit from what we did previously. I had just applied the BTI solution to the to the feeding zone. But I think that the better approach is typically to apply it to the top surface of material. It's right out here on the top, because that's obviously where the little flying insects are going to hang out. I don't think that the type of creature that's going to try to burrow very deep down into the material. So since this stuff actually targets their larvae, I think that applying it right in the beginning, right to the space that they're most likely occupying, is the best way to get it straight to the target. And then I could start, you know, fiddling around in here and mixing things up. So let's see if we can kind of follow suit here. What did we do? I guess we took care of feeding, then we gave ourselves the opportunity to peek around the outer edges to see how things are holding up from a moisture perspective. So we'll see if we can replicate what we did in the first bin over here. Here it feels like perhaps the worms are coming a little bit closer to the surface. I see a few kind of hanging out over here. So that's kind of cool. I mean, I do my best to try to run these tandem bins, or these sort of sister bins or twin bins or whatever, very similar to one another. But there's always going to be little deviations. Maybe in this system we had a little bit more moisture content than the other one. I don't remember if it was this pair of bins or another one, but there was this sort of observation. I think that maybe one of the bins had a slight advantage by maybe having a few more worms in it, and maybe the other bin had a little bit of an advantage by more of the bin being more damp. I'm not quite sure. Here we go. Here's the other piece of pumpkin stem. There's a little worm hanging out on it, or maybe in it already. Not a whole lot of activity on it, but it's early. I don't think it went in right in the very beginning. It might have gone in as one of the earlier feedings, I'm pretty sure, but maybe not one of the first ones, maybe the second or third, I don't know. There was a point in time when I was running one of my bins in such a way that I kept track of what was fed at each turn. Then we kept actually relocating each of those feedings, so I was always able to know exactly how old a particular piece of leftover food was, because I was tracking what was being fed when, enabling me to calculate its age, and then really be able to get a sense of how something was progressing over time in the worm bin. It's a little bit onerous to take on that extra chore of being so detailed in the record keeping. As much as I like to keep records, I try to limit the record keeping to more vital bits of info that pertain really to my decision making. I remember somebody was interested in kind of setting up their own little tracking system, and they wanted to track humidity and barometric pressure and weigh things, and to me that seemed like very interesting if you've got the bandwidth and time and patience to, you know, maintain that sort of information. And I'm sure that it would possibly even help in future troubleshooting if you're, you know, having issues or whatever the case may be. But I feel like the information bits that I store are sufficient for my needs. Sometimes I'll start tracking new bits of information in my tracking spreadsheet, but I'm usually pretty content with the bits of info that I track. You know, stuff like the age of the bin, the estimated count, the number of feedings that have been applied, just the duration of time that has lapsed in between feedings, things like that. Then I'll let my spreadsheet calculate things such as averages and other things like that. So that's one of the beauties of maintaining your information in a spreadsheet, is that you can then relate certain bits of information to one another and let the spreadsheet do the math for you, sometimes revealing some interesting info. So we're once again following suit with what we did earlier in the first bin by recycling all this top covering leaf material as the bedding and the foundation for today's feeding. I'm trying to just nudge all the other stuff outwards so that we've got ample room down here to fit the food and still have enough stuff out on the outer edges to cover up with. Okay, looking good. All right, so now I'm trying to remember how we did this exactly. Whatever, maybe a little bit of BTI. I'm almost out. I'm gonna have to refill this bottle, but I figured I still had a few more squirts in here. How did we do this? We might have just come straight in here at this point with the feeding, so let's do that again. Just drop it in and see if we can compare it to what we had earlier. I think it does look like a comparable quantity of food. Very similar to what we applied to bin number 1. There again, it's, you know, just interesting, I think, to try to maintain the systems in a similar enough way that you can almost treat them as being identical. And then, kind of like what I alluded to earlier, to me that just seems like if one system starts doing something that you're really liking and the other one is not, then, you know, maybe there was some sort of a deviation, or maybe there's something lurking in there that you didn't notice that you need to try to track down and, you know, figure out exactly what it is before you proceed. One thing we didn't do here though was, yeah, okay, no, I think we're okay. Scratch that. We put in grit. We put in my kind of mixture of coffee and worm chow, which is my preferred way of applying the worm chow. I usually like to add the worm chow either to the coffee that I've put in, or sometimes to my prepared bedding that I put in. But more recently I've just been treating the coffee and the worm chow as sort of a good combination of stuff to combine with one another. Alright, I think we're almost there. I always get this sense like I'm forgetting something, but hopefully I've not overlooked anything too crucial. And maybe now we can kind of go big time on the excavation of the outer edges to examine how things out here look. Once again, I'm always just kind of looking for little differences, or at least, you know, if nothing else, at least verifying consistency. But I think that one thing I'm observing here is that the material out on this outer edge seems a little bit less broken down than what I observed in the other system somehow. There again, it could just be imagining, could just be my vivid imagination telling me that I'm seeing things that I'm not really seeing. But to me, somehow, when we opened up the outer edge in the other bin, at least on this side, it seemed like it was more densely packed with castings. Here it seemed like it was perhaps a little bit more a mix of, you know, residual bedding bits and whatever. And maybe it's just a little flipperoo, because here it seems like we are seeing a good bit of casting material with perhaps a little bit fewer bits of, you know, debris mixed in. So I don't know. I think it's more or less a wash. I guess the only other difference to note here is that there was that one little flying insect that greeted us in the very beginning, and I think I might have spotted one or two other ones, but nothing chronic, nothing to ring the alarm bells about, if you ask me. Especially since we squirted in the BTI, I think those countermeasures do take a little while to kick in, because you're not going to wipe out the active living fruit flies or gnats. You're really kind of targeting their offspring from being able to develop to the point where they become active mating adult flies. So like I said, it's more of a preventative measure. It's not a, you know, not a direct pesticide, so to speak. All right, I think we're almost there. Let's get these things covered up. And like we did in the other one, we're adding a top covering of plastic now. So I think next time we come into these systems, we're probably going to see a whole lot more activity out on the top surface. Systems that have these plastic coverings do seem to have a good bit of worm traffic right out on the surface a lot of times, because that's where the moisture is sort of recirculating, and sometimes even, you know, coming down in little droplets, maybe collecting on the paper right beneath the plastic. The worms really dig that, so I don't know. I guess we'll see when we get back in here next time. Alright everyone, that's the end of the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.